Okay, Andrew was the Senior Compliance Officer at Nordea. It's Ian, as we know, as the CEO of Sanctions SOS, and Ian, and also a visiting research fellow at the King's College London on sanctions. We have Mark, partner at Duane Morris in London, and we have Aleksi, the CEO of Solid Plan Consulting from Helsinki. And before we start, I will have two practical information. The first one is that what we discussed today have to be considered as informational purpose only, and therefore not as a legal advice. If you have specific issues in your organization, I recommend you to reach out to your legal team and also your compliance team to get proper advices. And on that note, I will say if you have any other questions towards what we will be discussing today or what a panelist will give of information, feel free to type in any questions. You can also write them into the mail address info@nfcp.info. And then we will answer all the questions after this short webinar. But let's start. I am the moderator today. I'm not so important as the rest, but I can shortly introduce myself. I am AFC specialist, independent advisor, and owner of the RBA Advisory, and I'm also board member of the ACAMS Nordic chapter. But I will only be the moderator, so don't listen much to me, but listen to the panelists. They know what they're talking about. And what we have seen now lately in the sanction workspace is something I never have thought I will discover or see in my lifetime at least, is that they are easing some sanctions, and that is against Syria. So there is something going on the sanction part that we have not seen before. And on that note, I will start with you, Andrew, as the U.S. expert. What's going on?
Sure. Yeah. So I'll talk about Syria, but I just want to talk about the U.S. and OFAC in general. I'm sure as anyone listening will be aware that there is a lot of shakeup in the U.S. government and all the federal agencies with personnel changes and downsizing is OFAC. And even though, I'll talk about department was looking to slash staffing within Treasury, but it was targeting the IRS, so the tax revenue, and OFAC was largely untouched. So I think that says something in and of itself, not that the current administration is heading in one direction or the other, but that it recognizes the importance of OFAC and what it can do. Regarding sanctions, OFAC hasn't done much recently. Since the new administration has come into the White House, there hasn't been a lot of enforcement actions. I don't think that there have been any enforcement actions, or at least not any new ones that weren't started in the previous administration. And nothing really towards Russia, which it shouldn't surprise anyone. And that was kind of the steer that Trump gave when he was running for president back in 2024. There was a lot of cooperation prior to the current administration with EU and the G8 countries with sanctions and designations. Particularly, they were coincided. They were done together with a large cooperation that has kind of stalled. But what came as a bit of a surprise to me was when OFAC came out with a memo last week in joint cooperation with the Swiss government. And so that kind of is, signaling that although OFAC can't do what it was doing before, that there's still players in place that are trying to do as much as they can in terms of cooperating with other governments. And going back to Syria, last week, OFAC issued a general license that effectively does away with all the prohibitions of the Syrian sanctions regulations, the SSR. They haven't completely removed the SSR, and that's because it's been codified by Congress. And so any removal of those types of regulations has to go through a different process. But the general license effectively removes those prohibitions. And it's because of the changes that have been made recently in Syria last year and this year. And so the idea is to kind of rebuild Syria as a country and then also as a trading partner. So that's my quick update from the US, but happy to add more.
Yeah, I have a question because I could also see that I was happy to discover that they want to generate a beneficial owner register in the US. What happened to that?
I don't think officially it's dead, but it is definitely sleeping. And that registry of beneficial owners, it was very specific, or at least I think the layering that's present within the United States. And so, even if you know who the beneficial owner is, ultimate beneficial owner is outside the United States, within the United States, there can be many, many layers that there will be no transparency. So even in name, it would be useful, but I think in practice, it would be largely useless. But I don't know where it is now, but I know that it's not in the pipeline. So
have you also maybe discovered something towards the sanctions in this matter, that I have seen that the Justice Department have given a memorandum also towards that they should be more specific on cases related to American interests and not so much towards the rest. So they could also, prioritize their short resources.
yeah, so that's a very diplomatic way of putting Trump's policy of America first, and that's definitely the steer from the current administration, and all of his appointees are backing that program, of the America First program. And even if something, it seems like it would be not conducive to sanctions adherence, they're flying it under the America First flags. That's exactly right.
Good. Thank you, Moon. There's no question I can see in the chat, so I go to you, Ian. Is there any news from the UK side?
So there's been a lot of changes recently on the UK side. There's I think we're a year behind on the enforcement year that the UK government had announced, but we are starting to see enforcement actions coming through on a fairly routine basis now. So we've had OFSI and HMRC looking to do some enforcement actions, and I'll leave Mark to maybe discuss in his broader overview of enforcement actions, but it is telling in terms of a general direction. If you speak to UK government at the moment, there is a lot of focus around enforcement and implementation of sanctions. Last week, they announced a review of how sanctions in the UK have been enforced and implemented, and they have announced a number of deliverables, including shortening a real focus on that side of things. From a regimes and designation perspective, the UK is still obviously a strong proponent of sanctions and will look to coordinate with allies wherever possible. Increasingly, that looks like coordinating with the EU, Canada, Australia, other G7 members. As we heard with Andrew, the US is kind of not necessarily as part of that grouping anymore as it once was. And I think we saw that with Syria, because it feels like both the UK and the EU not only were taken aback by how quickly Trump decided to move on Syria, but also just in terms of what he did in terms of the lifting. So I know from a UK perspective that there are some concerns still around the shape of the Syrian government, what's happening in Syria. There is some nervousness around lifting everything, yet at the same time, there is a strong desire and will for the private sector to re-engage in Syria, for reconstruction to be able to take place. And it feels a little bit from a UK perspective as if we're back in a Iran JCPOA territory, where we've got a lifting of sanctions, but without necessarily understanding what that means for private sector in terms of engagement. And in some respects, I would advocate that the having a general license actually in some respects is easier, because it kind of gives you the okay from the government to do what you're going to do, right? Whereas this is kind of like, well, we've lifted everything, but obviously you need to be conscious of what might occur in the country and who you're dealing with, which doesn't really give you the full reassurances you might need. We've seen continuous action on Russia, and on this, we're still seeing the UK coordinate with the EU quite a lot. Real focus around shipping and the dark fleet, looking at the oil price cap as well. So those are key focal points on the Russia side. We're seeing bits and pieces alongside that in terms of focusing on some elements of around Sudan, around anti-corruption, human rights regimes, seeing a passing interest in what's happening with the Iran negotiations between Trump and Iran. Obviously, the UK is still party to the JCPOA, but I think there is an understanding that there are real risks around that this year. It is the final year of the JCPOA, and if by October there isn't a new deal, that will be the last opportunity for snapback. So I know there's a lot of focus on that as well. And then finally, we did see something a little bit bizarre just yesterday, which was the lifting of designations against everyone under the Zimbabwe regime. But the Zimbabwe regime has stayed in place. So it is a completely blank regime with no other impacts, which is a bit bizarre. And I'm not entirely sure what that means or what the UK government really wants to do with that.
I have a question to you. How do you see the alignment between the UK and the EU sanctions? Are they still completely one-to-one, or how do you see it?
I think largely speaking, yes. I think there's always been some little bit of differences here and there in terms of exactly who's designated or specific measures. I think the UK has a bit more freedom to move on sanctions, where the EU sort of obviously needing to get all member states to agree might start in the same position as where the UK's at on sanctions, but sometimes has to water down. I don't know to what degree it's sort of coordination at that level versus just happy coincidence, if I'm being honest about it. I mean, I suspect there's a degree of discussion going on behind the scenes with certain key member states and the UK, but I think, the UK is sort of keen to just get on with things on the sanctions side. I think it's still seen as one of the areas where we spend our time continuously rehashing Brexit. I think that Samler is the one side where we kind of go, yeah, you know what, there are some actual potential benefits around this. We have started moving quicker. We are able to do things a bit differently here. So I think there is a degree to which we're happy in the UK to just kind of chart our own path. But it's always better if you can do it with others as well. So definitely on the coordination side, and also looking more broadly, at the Canadians, the Australians as well.
And a question here towards crypto. I know that we in Europe have released the MiCA regulation towards the crypto and the crypto market. And have they also unveiled the regulation to crypto in the UK, and how is that affecting sanctions?
I have to say that I haven't actually paid that much attention to crypto recently in the UK. I don't know, Mark, do you know?
Yeah, a draft regulation was published about 2 or 3 weeks ago, which is quite different from MiCA, but which is broadly speaking going to impose a requirement for crypto services providers to be regulated by the FCA.
Okay, thank you very much. And now you already started more the global aspect on this sanction, the environment here, the last 1 or 2 months.
Sure. Well, in the EU, there's been quite a lot that's been happening. As most people will be aware, the 17th package came out on the 20th of May. Not a huge amount in there. Asset freezes imposed on another sort of 17 individuals and 60 companies. Lots of Russian companies in there, but also Israel, Hong Kong, Turkey, Dubai, China. As ever, don't just screen a Russian company, screen everyone that you're dealing with. Major energy players like Serget were added to the asset freeze. That lots of new entries added to the list of military end users for the purposes of trade restrictions, including from Vietnam, Turkey, Dubai, Serbia. So again, screening imperative. New products added to the export prohibitions, especially in the electronics and chemical sectors. And then perhaps the thing that got most publicity, a substantial increase in the list of shadow fleet vessels named in the EU's sanctions. So there are now 342 such vessels, which is a big policy change from only a few months ago, where the EU seemed to be wary of too much designation because they didn't want to impact the global oil market and global oil prices too much. They seem to have decided that the time has come to worry less about those sorts of things, and hundreds of vessels have now been added to the list. And we'll see how Russia responds to that. I've seen in press stories in the last few days that the Russian Navy has started to escort shadow vessels through the Gulf of Finland, which does not bode well, but we'll see where that comes out. Separately from the 17th package, although clearly related, there are sort of 50 other designations under the Russian human rights, Russian hybrid threats, and Ukraine chemical weapons lists. So, don't just screen against Regulation 269 and 833. There are lots of other Russians designated under other regimes as well. Just in that context, one of the regulations that came out, which is almost meaningless at the moment because it has a bunch of empty annexes, is one of the hybrid threats regulation 964, which has quite different enforcement architecture targeting specific assets rather than necessarily the whole suite of a person, hitting non-EU financial institutions that are involved in transactions that facilitate directly or indirectly a range of specified activities largely related to destabilization. So at the moment, it's splendidly short. It's only a couple of pages. But it's a different sort of different sort of regime. And obviously the work on the 18th package, as ever, seems to have already started, may even be in the next few weeks. We'll see exactly what that contains. Ian mentioned enforcement in the UK. There was one £5,000 fine imposed on a company that just steadfastly ignored information requests from OFSI, and they kept getting written to by OFSI. The company kept not replying and finally got fined £5,000. I'm not sure that has a great dissuasive effect on anyone, although the one interesting part about the penalty notice was that the information request arose in the context of a broader investigation into Softcomflot, which is the first that's been made public. I don't really know what the shape and scale of that Softcomflot investigation is, but clearly OFSI's been out there trying to gather information, and this one particular entity just thumbed its nose and ignored OFSI and has been fined £5,000. In the rest of the EU, Germany, there have been raids in relation to luxury car exporter, estimated 25 million euros worth of luxury cars, about 700 cars, and criminal investigation that started there. In Poland, customs seized 5 tons of aviation tires and launched criminal proceedings for exports to, they were being exported, I think, to a combination of Russia and Belarus. And over April and May, there have been 3 or 4 raids by Polish customs in relation to timber imports from Russia and Belarus. So they're being quite active in Poland. Just yesterday, I think it was, the Dutch Court of Appeal in The Hague doubled the prison sentence of someone that had been convicted a few months ago for exports via Central Asia. So they had got 18 months. It's now just under 3 years because the prosecution had appealed the length of the sentence. In Latvia, there's just in the last few weeks, a new investigation that's been launched in relation to machinery and equipment for military manufacturing that was exported to Russia via Central Asia member states. And in that context, the enforcement directive, the deadline for implementation was supposed to be the 20th of May. A lot of member states have missed that deadline. Some have met it. What the EU does in response to missing that deadline, we'll see. It's somewhat surprising that that deadline has been missed by so many member states given the current environment, but there we go. They were certainly given plenty of time to get their act together. Syria announced lifting of sanctions, of some sanctions at least. The Assad regime and its cohorts will remain designated. Some goods will remain prohibited, but there'll be a lifting. But I think the fine print of that remains to be seen as and when the regulations get amended. But that's certainly the movement that's taking place there.
Good for the update, and I can see there's a lot of work to be done against sanction circumventions. And but I have a question to you. The new organ, the EU organ AMLA, there have earlier been some indication that they should take care of some part of the sanction framework. Do you have any information about that at the moment?
I've probably seen the similar sort of press that you've seen as to whether AMLA is a body or a comparable body that will deal with sanctions should be put in place. I haven't seen anything specific that will empower AMLA to embark on sanctions regulation or enforcement. So, but I think there was a white paper from the Dutch government a few months ago where they were advocating a more centralized enforcement architecture in Europe. Whether that happens, I'm not sure. I'm not even sure it's a good thing, but that may well be part of what the EU is considering. How that will work with countries like Hungary and Slovakia, I don't know. Whether any sort of central enforcement regime will get put in place, I don't know.
We will see how that ends. And then thank you very much, Mark. And then Aleksi, now to the Nordic aspect. Is there anything that we should mention that have happened the last 1 or 2 months?
Yeah, thanks. So the buzzwords are enforcement and counter circumvention here as well. So a couple of things of interest, potentially work to be done there. In Finland specifically, some things that might be of broader interest. We had our first sanctions-related case go all the way up to the Supreme Court here in Finland maybe 2 months ago, a case on asset freezing, specifically a case where a Finnish company had brought fertilizers from a Dubai-based trader, and as they were making the payment, their bank froze that, payment because they had information that suggesting that potentially the fertilizers had been purchased by the Dubai trader from a company in Russia, which then again allegedly might have been owned by a Russian sanctioned oligarch. So they felt that releasing that payment would lead to funds being made indirectly available to that guy. And, the Supreme Court held that case in favor of the bank and of the Finnish authorities, saying that it was, even though the evidence supporting the freezing was sort of semi-flimsy in terms of it being based largely on media reports and a bit of some customs data here and there, they said that in a context where it is very difficult to obtain reliable evidence, given that the potential perpetrators are in Russia, that it was enough for them to establish sort of a prima facie case that there is likelihood of funds being made available, and that this was enough for the Dubai trader then to be in a position to have to produce some counter evidence of their own, in particular because they were in the best possible position to show that they had bought the fertilizer for someone else. And they had, because they failed to do that, the court felt that the asset freeze was justified and maintained it. Other interesting stuff here, some may know a couple of years ago, we added a provision into our AML Act that specifically requires obliged entities to establish effective policies, procedures, and internal controls for the purposes of complying with EU and UN sanctions and our own domestic asset freeze regulations. And the interesting bit is that we are now seeing the first round of supervision visits into Finnish financial institutions by the FinFSA. First report that I saw, at least, was a visit report on a sort of a smallish Finnish retailer bank connected to a retail chain of stores, and it's really horrible reading. They were clearly very, very displeased with how they were going about ones and a whole range of smaller ones, including statements to the fact that the bank had really essentially failed to establish any sensible sanctions in a one-page summary of their findings. So it was horrible stuff, and I'm sure that banks in Finland are sort of not feeling too happy about their upcoming visits and the level of scrutiny that they will get. And then maybe one final thing on the circumvention in Finland and in other Nordic countries, I suppose, as well, but in Finland in particular, a number of our authorities here are being very active in terms of outreach to the private sector, including the financial sector, on counter-circumvention activities, not only the FinFSA and other bodies, but also relatively rarely in Finland, our intelligence community came up with a major bit of guidance or assessment in their annual sort of Finnish security report. One of the key things they were highlighting there was the prevalence of Chinese and Russian espionage in Finland and in Europe, and in particular then on top of that of Russian circumvention activities. A couple of things there that might be worth a read, including the fact that they were saying that they are seeing that given that there's been a lot of focus by financial institutions and exporters alike on countering sanction circumvention through third countries, that we are seeing, they say, more and more of Russian circumvention networks and illicit acquisition networks penetrating the European Union and our domestic markets. And they were adamant in warning companies in Finland that they should not only look at sort of country-based risk, but they should be cautious as to all sort of potentially problematic approaches, including from companies right in their domestic markets. But that's my 5 cents on what's going on here in the cold Nordic region of Europe. Thanks.
Thank you very much. It has been a pleasure to listen to all of you, and that's a lot of stuff happening at the moment, and I'm sure that the next few months there will be more to talk about. And I will also say thank you to all the ones who have participated and spread the news about this organization that is non-profitable organization. As more as member we become, we will also maybe be able to have some physical events, so you can meet Andrew, Mark, Ian, and Alexis in person maybe one day, and so we can have way more deep discussions over a cup of coffee or whatever.
Thank you.
Bye.
Cheers, all. Bye.